The year is 1978. Five young men decided to attend a college basketball game on Friday, February 24th. This wasn't just any game, but their favorite team, the UC Davis Aggies, were going up against the Chico State Wildcats. This also wasn't an ordinary weekend, because the next day they would be also playing in their own basketball tournament that could lead them down the road to the Special Olympics. Their team, the Gateway Gators, consisted of Ted Weiher, Gary Mathias, Jack Madruga, Jack Hueet, and Bill Sterling. To say they were excited would be an understatement, as they even had their jerseys laid out ready for the next morning. These five young men had grown very close and were even known to those around them as the boys. Jack Madruga picked up the boys that Friday night in his beloved 1969 Mercury Montego. This was Madruga's prized possession, and he took every precaution to keep this Montego in pristine condition. All the boys lived in Yuba City or the neighboring Marysville area. The 1-hour drive was worth it because UC Davis beat Chico State that night. After the game was over, they headed to a nearby gas station called Bears Market to load up on drinks and snacks for the hour-long drive back home. The closing clerk was mightily annoyed since it was very close to the closing time of 10 p.m. The five men headed back to Yuba City, but little did the clerk know that she would be the last verified person to see these five men that night. This is the story of the bizarre disappearance of the Yuba County Five. On that same Friday evening, Joe Shones took his Volkswagen up towards Roger Campground in the Plumas National Forest. His family was planning a weekend getaway that Saturday morning, and he wanted to make sure the conditions were going to be good for them during the weekend. As he got further up the mountain, his vehicle got stuck in the snow and he was unable to proceed any further. Joe got out of his car and began to attempt to push his vehicle out of the snow, but his luck would get even worse. He began to suffer the signs of a heart attack. Alone and miles away from help, he got back into his car hoping he would feel better. As time passed and nightfall had already set in, he noticed two headlights of a pickup truck approaching from behind. The vehicle stopped, and he saw a group of men and women holding a baby get out of the vehicle. He could hear the voices in the distance. He thought this might be his only chance at survival, so he got out of his car to try to flag them down. Suddenly, the group grew silent, and the headlights turned off. The group and truck disappeared into the night. Hours later, he saw a group of people approaching from the same direction, holding flashlights. Again, he tried to get help, but they ignored his calls and disappeared into the night as well. When Joe Shones began feeling better, he decided to walk back down the mountain to get help from a lodge roughly 8 miles away. As he was walking, he passed by a 1969 Mercury Montego, but there was nobody around. He thought to himself that this could have belonged to the one of the groups he saw earlier. Joe continued his 8-mile hike back down the mountain. When the five men didn't return home that night after the basketball game, their parents started to get worried. This was not like any of them. They were all used to following a very similar routine every night. Throw in the fact that they had that very important basketball game for their team, the Gateway Gators, the next morning, and everyone knew something was wrong. They called the police and reported the 5 of them missing. Sadly, they ran into 2 problems with this. One, that they were grown adult men, so it wasn't taken very serious in the beginning. In order to fully understand these 5, we need to discuss exactly who they are. Now, the Gateway Gators was a basketball team for the Yuba County Gateway program that helped those with learning disabilities, or in the case of Gary Mathias, with his schizophrenia. So due to this and the fact that they were grown adults, in the beginning of this case, law enforcement didn't take it very seriously, and if they did, maybe the outcome would be a little different. Once law enforcement did actually start investigating, they were looking in all the wrong places. It wasn't until a missing person report and posters were put up about the boys that a park ranger came forward and told investigators that he had seen the Mercury Montego parked on the snow line up in the Plumas National Forest. Once the families and the investigators got to the car, they noticed a few oddities. One was that the driver's side window was slightly rolled down. This is something that Jack from Madruga would never have done due to the fear of the interior of his car getting messed up. He always made sure to keep his windows closed. Upon further investigation, there was no undercarriage damage to the vehicle either. With 5 grown men driving up an unknown mountain road in the dark, this seems almost impossible. What even made this case more bizarre is that these 5 strong men could have easily dislodged the Mercury Montego from being stuck in the snow line, but instead decided to head in the opposite direction of where society was, and headed further up the snowy Plumas National Forest. At this point, search teams began looking for the 5 men, but it was no easy task. The terrain was very rough and rocky, the snowy weather, and really having no information on where the boys were headed. Different leads and even sightings over the next few months led to no new information, and even the search parties had to be called off due to weather. The boys are left to fend for themselves up in the snowy Plumas Mountains. June 4th, 1978. A group of motorcyclists headed into the Plumas National Forest. They came upon an abandoned campground service trailer and decided to have a look around. One of the trailers had a broken window, and when looking inside, they made a grim discovery. The body of Ted Weiher was discovered with sheets draped over his body, his shoes were removed, and his feet were badly frostbitten. It looked like he had lost around almost 80 pounds during this time. The motorcycle group contacted the authorities, and the search by the trailer began. A little over 4 miles away, the remains of Sterling and Madruga were found as well. Madruga was still holding on to his keys of his beloved Mercury Montego. It wasn't long after that the skeletal remains of Hueet's body were found as well by his father. Until this day, the body of Gary Mathias has never been located. The search for the boys came to a heartbreaking end. Many theories and speculations have come up over the years, but still the biggest unanswered question in this case is why was the Mercury Montego that belonged to Jack Madruga this far up in the Plumas National Forest? This was 70 miles away from the basketball game they attended at Chico State and over 35 miles away from where the boys lived. There are so many questions surrounding this case, and the deeper down the rabbit hole you go, the more questions you come up with, and the less you actually understand on what really happened that fateful night. The best we could really do is go over the information we have and try to come up with some sort of conclusion on what really happened. First off, our witness Joe Shones that said he walked by the Mercury Montego after he suffered his heart attack is very hard to believe. From what I learned from the research, many that knew him said he was a very unreliable person and a very big storyteller. Every time the police interviewed him about what he saw, his story would always change. After a while, he started to blame it on the symptoms from his heart attack, stating that he might have just imagined seeing people out in the Plumas National Forest. Now, the biggest problem with this case is that many of the leads and information in this case just led to dead ends. For example, another store clerk stated she saw a few of the boys using a payphone and they happened to be just driving in a truck. This lead didn't lead to any new information, and since there was award money for information on the case, a lot of bad info would come forward. Even with what we do know about the case, we still are no closer to understanding why they were up there in the first place. In a book titled Out of Bounds, What Happened to the Yuba County Five by an author Drew Beeson, stated he did his own face-to-face investigation on the case. The information that he got from the locals stated that there was a brawl at Bear Market right as the boys were leaving. It stated that Gary Mathias was protecting one of his friends and a fight broke out. After the fight, the boys left but were possibly being chased by the other party. For whatever reason, they decided to drive up the Plumas National Forest in hopes of losing their pursuers, and that's when they got stuck in the snow line. They decided they were still in some sort of danger and got out of the Montego and walked further up the mountain. Now, this is all just speculation, but either by choice to get away from their pursuers or possibly by force. This could explain why the window was partially rolled down because Jack Madruga never would have done that himself. It's even rumored that this group could have got a hold of Gary Mathias and disposed of his body in the nearby lake, which is why his body was never found. Possibly one of the pursuers took the driver's seat by force and drove the four up the mountain as the others took care of Gary Mathias. This could be why there was no undercarriage damage to the Montego because this unknown driver knew the road very well. Now with this scenario, I just see a few problems. One issue would be if someone took the car by force, why would anyone care enough to drive slow up the mountain road to not cause damage to the car? More than likely, he would have tried to purposely damage the car because it wasn't his and furthering provoking the situation. If the five were being chased up the mountain, I doubt Jack Madruga would have been driving so slow and careful to not damage his own car. The end result of how in good shape the car was with no damage seems to debunk this scenario to me. Trust me, I did a lot of research for this video and nowhere did I find any information on this bear market brawl except for what was presented in the book. We know that the closing clerk would have seen and heard all the commotion going on and the information about it would be somewhere. She more than likely would have told the police this information as well unless she was threatened by someone, but without any real info on it, it's just all speculation at this point. Another theory is that due to Gary Mathias' schizophrenia, that he might have had an episode and somehow got them headed up the Plumas National Forest road. From what his family has said, that he had been very vigilant in taking his medication and hadn't had an episode in quite some time, but again, this is just what they said. There is no actual evidence on any of this, and you would think that the inside of the car could possibly show some sort of outburst inside. It also speculated that Gary Mathias could have convinced the group to go visit some of his friends in nearby Forbestown. This is where they were headed, and they missed their turn and ended up the Plumas National Forest. This also seems unlikely because these other 4 men were very used to certain structure and schedules, to even the point that some didn't want to sleep anywhere else but their own bed. Again, we are still left wondering why they ended up where they did, and maybe it's just a simple explanation that due to all the excitement for their favorite team winning and them having a game themselves the next morning, they just missed their proper turnoff. It's a very dark road and obviously no navigation to make sure they didn't miss their exit. Once they realized this, they decided to try to turn around and headed up the Plumas National Forest road. They didn't find a good safe spot to do this turnaround, so that wouldn't damage Jack Madruga's prized possession. This kept them going farther and farther up the mountain until they got slightly stuck in the snow. Instead of thinking of trying to dislodge the car or head back down the mountain, maybe they thought they would find shelter or help a little further up the mountain. They kept going expecting to find what they needed just over the next hill. Again, this is still hard to explain because the abandoned service cabin was 19 miles away from the Montego. Even if the other bodies were 5 miles closer to the car, that's still 15 miles up the mountain. You would think, why wouldn't they just turn back around at some point? Again, more questions without any real answer. Strangely enough, the small cabins surrounding the one that Ted's body was found in had food enough to last them for months if rationed properly. They had things to build a fire and even a propane heater that just needed to be lit. So why did the boys not take advantage of what they found? The parents of the boys believe it's because other than Gary and Mathias, the other 4 had no previous records of any sort. They would have never wanted to steal from another person, and if they thought for some reason that they were taking food that belonged to someone else, they wouldn't want to touch it. Now this was a very upsetting case that really kept me up at night wondering exactly what happened and knowing that these young 5 men had to endure the harsh elements of the Plumas National Forest during the winter. Losing a loved one is never easy. But these families had to deal with hoping to find their beloved son safe and sound over the course of a few months, but learned of the tragic fate they faced in the cold Plumas National Forest.